Bakher Khatin, hoş geldiniz, and welcome to This is Revolution. My name is Jean Bajlan, in for Jason Miles tonight. And before we begin the show, I would like to remind viewers, if you enjoy this content, please consider liking and subscribing to the This is Revolution YouTube channel. If you're watching on Van Vlog, subscribe to Van Vlog. Give us a like and give us a comment. We always appreciate the comments. Sometimes you will find us down there in the comments tussling with people. We do enjoy a good comment tussle when time permits. And of course, we have Patreon. If you enjoy everything, Patreon helps keep things going at This is Revolution and Van Vlog Farms. So tonight we are going to be talking for this very special White Guy Wednesday. And I want to emphasize, it is very White Guy Wednesday tonight. We have the whitest guy in left media on this evening, although he does claim to be pink, to talk about the Twitter files. So the Twitter files have been in the news, as people are probably aware. Matt Taibbi and friends have been given access to certain internal documents from Twitter, handed to them by the new management of Elon Musk, and they are revealing all kinds of shenanigans going on under the surface. But are the Twitter files important? Are they revealing anything that we didn't know? Is it just confirmation? Do they suggest something untoward is happening? Well, that will be the topic for this evening. So let me bring on the co-host, of course, for this evening. The one, the only C. Derek Vaughn. How are you doing? The angry badger off the left.
I'm doing well. I've been unfortunately or fortunately reading a whole lot of Matt Taibbi reporting and Barry Weiss reporting, and listening to congressional hearings for this, because I realized that there's more to this than I thought. But, and there's, I guess the but here is, I think this is a much longer pattern of behavior that predates social media. And I don't even know that Doug disagrees with me on that. But it's something we're going to need to look at, because I think that's going to help us understand the current milieu, which is, me blowing where I'm going to go with this, I think, for our guest's sake, before we really get going.
Well, let's bring on our guest, the third D in this Triple D episode. He is the CEO and Supremo of Sublation Media. He is, in the view of the current Zero Books editors, a war criminal, the one, the only, Douglas Lain. How are you doing, Douglas Lain?
Well, I'm doing great. Have they called me a war criminal? Did I miss that tweet?
I think it's implied.
I think Xenogothic may have said something to the
Xenogoth may have said something, something to that extent. You are a war criminal.
Well, all right, I'll accept that. Yeah, I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to talk about the Twitter files. The reason I'm kind of on a warpath, I'm actually using Twitter again, which I haven't really done in months, is because I watched the Twitter file, or actually the weaponization of government hearings that the Republicans put together, and watched the Democrats, I thought, completely disgrace themselves for 2.5 hours every step of the way. And we'll talk about our differences about, I guess Gene here is a big fan all of a sudden of Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
I am a big fan of Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Yes, a very big fan of her.
But I feel someone said in the chat before this started that, we're back to the culture war again. And what I would want to emphasize at the start is that this is not a story about the culture war. The Twitter files should not be interpreted as just one more salvo in the back and forth between the intellectual dark web and Sam Cedar. This is a serious story that I think should be put into the context of the work that Julian Assange has done, and the Edward Snowden revelations, and probably a lot of other journalism that's been done that doesn't have a celebrity journalist attached to it. But it should be put into the context of the expansion of the security state since 9/11, at the very least, and the disappearance of basic civil liberties and the right to politically organize and the right to
Well,
think independently.
well, let's start at the beginning for people who are not exactly following what the Twitter files are, because of course I think because of the politicized nature of the Twitter files, how it's being kind of shoehorned into the Republican Democrat Punch and Judy show that we generally have in terms of American politics. You know, I gave a little bit of a kind of intro to what the Twitter files are, but Doug, since you've been following it a lot closely, what would you sum the Twitter files up as? What is it exactly? Why is it comparable to Snowden, Assange, and all those other things?
Well, it's reporting that's unfortunately being dropped on Twitter first about the internal operations of a major social media company, Twitter, and a number of journalists. I think Li Fong, Matt Taibbi, Barry Weiss, and Michael Schellenberger are the four that, at least that I know of, who have been going through these internal documents from Twitter and reporting on what they found, and in a way that's similar to the Snowden revelations. What you're finding it with this leak, which is kind of a unique leak and how it came about, is a lot of government corruption. Not just finding out about how Twitter moderators decided on who should be canceled online and who should be allowed to tweet, but we're learning about a partnership between the security state in the United States and Twitter, and also through these files, we're seeing documentation about a relationship with almost all of the major tech companies, all of the major social media companies. So, so that's how I would characterize the Twitter files story. It's an ongoing story. There's been a bunch of reports that come out. I hope that Varn, with his encyclopedic photographic memory, will be able to bring in more details than I'm going to be able to off the cuff. But one of the major revelations was that the NGOs that NGOs have formed as mediators between social media companies and, for instance, the Department of Homeland Security or CDC, so that they have regular communications set up between the state and Twitter in order to help them decide who to shadow ban, who to ban, what tweets should be allowed, and how to change their moderation policies to fit the current political moment, meaning fit the aims of the security state.
What would you add to that, Vaughn, in terms of Doug's description? Do you think that's a fair description of what the Twitter files are?
To some degree. I mean, one of the difference between what Assange and Snowden did and what we get with the Twitter files is we've not been given direct access to these ourselves. It's too much to do in any meaningful way. That's part of the problem. The amount of dialogue this entails would be, if dropped, almost impossible to comb through ourselves. And it's almost impossible for Taibbi or Barry Weiss to comb through it, as I think Doug pointed out on his own show. But as I've confirmed, there are engineers at Twitter who help him find specific searches, and then he gets to curate it. That's reporting, but it's reporting with secret sources in a way. Now, I'm not here to blame Taibbi for this. I'm not here to blame anyone for this, because the mainstream media has largely been out to lunch on a lot of these issues because they're busy doing tweet stenography instead of reporting, because it's cheaper, which is why most of the reporting has moved to Substack. And when I say reporting, I'm also there having to be very careful because, again, we're mostly reporting on docu information and we're not going out and breaking it in the same way. That's its own thing. One thing that I think I might push back on, though, is that this is new, because the fucking Hays Code existed. And what I mean by that is there has been an attempt by the federal government, empowered by 19th century court cases, to carve out where free speech actually applied and didn't apply in such a way that broadcasting actually doesn't fall under free speech rules. Yes, there is technically free speech on cable, but again, for fear of government regulation being used by interstate commerce clauses, so this is a long time coming, that the cable companies have always self-regulated. In many ways, this is the same kind of collusion. What makes this different, though, is it is more pointedly targeted since maybe the fairness doctrine. Now, I know a lot of liberals and maybe leftists like the fairness doctrine because they've never really thought about it. But what the fairness doctrine used to do was have more or less the government and editorial decide what the acceptable sides of the opinion were because you had to represent them. All right. So again, FCC rules indicate all this. What I think people,
Derek, I want to ask you a question. So, I remember, I think I know what the Hays Code was. I mean, I remember it. I've heard about it before. I've read it. I think I've even read about it, or at least seen references to it. And the fairness doctrine, I know what that was, and I know how the cable companies were self-regulated. But it used to be the case that these regulatory bodies, like the FCC, would put down standards that were based on like moral principles or kind of community standards, maybe involving protecting children from certain kind of sexual material, or in which would go all the way to on television. You couldn't show a couple in bed together; you had to have them in separate twin beds, things like that. It seems to me that in each of those cases, though, what you're talking about are attempts by government bureaucracies to set standards around community values on broadcasters, not to intervene on the level of what kinds of news stories can be reported on a day-to-day basis, not to say, okay, you can't talk about this particular bit of corruption that's been exposed in this company or in this branch of government, not to say that these kinds of opinions are not going to be allowed on the air. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that. Did the Hays Code include making it specific that certain kinds of ideologies?
The Hays Code actually does make it pretty clear that certain kinds of anti-Christian ideologies, of which all communism would have been included as an anti-Christian ideology, could not be included. Also, it's just not true that they didn't directly use this stuff. Now, we need to be clear. Hays Code is not a government document. The Hays Code was responding to government threats. Right. So
it's an internal regulation. Like as Van says, in order to preempt government regulation, we often see business collectives stepping in to self-regulate. This is like common not only in the United States but also in Great Britain as well. But I think what makes Twitter and social media a little different is not so much the existence of attempts from industry to self-regulate, to preempt further government intervention, but the nature of the media itself, in the sense that, print media or cable or television in general, trying to regulate that is very different from regulating these social media platforms, which are quite different in terms of the level of access. Anyone can come on and start a Twitter account. And so like the level of moderation that would be required requires a greater level of intervention, right? It's just a qualitatively and quantitatively new form of media, which people often talk about, the problem with social media, is that everything is on YouTube or on Twitter or on Facebook. It's all algorithms moderating everything. They just need to hire more people to moderate things by hand. But it's like, it's not really possible. You'd end up hiring millions of people to moderate this content. It's just not possible to moderate it on that level, right? So it's
but that's kind of an irrelevant point, because we're not the problem with what the Twitter files are revealing is not that there's algorithmic moderation that might be slanted, but that the State Department, or that the Department of Homeland Security, amongst other organizations, are directly communicating with Twitter staff to help set up the algorithms and to target individuals for suppression. So it's not a matter of like being concerned about the unfairness of the algorithm or something like that. It's a matter of not wanting to have the government partner with corporations to determine what is, appropriate thinking, or what can be said on what it was a public platform, or a relative, at least a kind of private public platform, before. I mean, if nothing else, just on the technicality of being a violation of the First Amendment, we should be outraged about this, because this is, an absolutely direct violation of the First Amendment. It is censorship by the state. It's not something else. So that's the primary thing that I would start with. The other thing I'm
going to challenge you on that, actually, because I was mentioning the specific law courts that moderate the First Amendment in such a way that has a 100-year precedent on state intervention in this areas of public broadcasting, because the way it is interpreted under Intercommerce Clause, speech is literally speech, as in what is said, in print, but not broadcast. And the internet is in a big fucking gray area to those laws. Now, I don't think those laws are valid, but they're part of the American legal tradition for over 120 years. So,
well, I mean, I would argue, if we're going to take the, if we're going to pretend to be lawyers in court, I would argue that in fact, Twitter and Facebook and other forms of social media should be treated more like print and journalism, and not like broadcasting, where you have to get a license and abide by regulations to get that license, which I'm not sure that I think that should be necessary. But we could go into the details of the kinds of legislations that was passed in the 90s to kind of set up what sorts of, how we should conceive of the internet in terms of how
we can talk about 1996, because I think the Supreme Court actually does something to punt on the problem, and the Telecommunications Act is sort of a compromise where they don't have to say, hey, our prior communications rulings are unconstitutional. But we realize that if we apply liability laws and the broadcasting laws that currently existed for broadcast to the internet, that it would collapse almost all free speech, because the onus on those laws is on the publisher for what is said on them. And it's not liability from the government, it's liability from lawsuit.
I mean, what about the fact that we're not talking about the Congress, setting up a law to regulate speech online and hashing out the constitutionality of it, but we're talking about, the secret police doing it in a clandestine way, infiltrating these organizations, setting up kind of false front organizations to do it, what about that? I mean, shouldn't we put this more in the context of the?
Give us a concrete example of what you're talking about. So we're not talking about it in the abstract. In terms of what examples would you say perhaps best illustrate the point, the most egregious examples of the?
I wish I remembered the name of the organization that was mentioned in the Twitter hearings. That was an NGO that had been set up as a mediator between the DHS and Twitter. But what is certainly the case is that on a regular basis, emails were received and communications were received in all kinds of ways, with lists of accounts that needed to be, thousands of accounts that needed to be suppressed, or that means like shadow banned or banned outright, tweets that needed to be taken down, and that would also communicate the kinds of content to be on the lookout for in the future. they included, things that were labeled as disinformation and misinformation, but also something called malinformation, which is stories that were true by all accounts, but might lead some people to conclusions that say, for instance, the CDC didn't want people to be led to, like stories that would talk about the side effects of the vaccine were to be suppressed, even if every bit of the information in those stories was true. This wasn't coming from a regulatory board that was set up by the Congress in an act of law. This was being done by unaccountable police organizations within the state.
Do you think it would be legitimate for the Congress to have set up such a body to regulate these social media institutions? Are there things, for example, on Twitter that should be banned?
My stance is that that if it's not illegal speech, in other words, if the speech isn't a threat or in some way in violation of the law that's already existing, then it shouldn't be it shouldn't be regulated online. Now, there was a problem with YouTube around how the YouTube channel might be viewed by younger people. I mean, they had an advertising. They had set up a model for their advertising, so that they could collect data on all the viewers, and so they didn't want to be seen to be making content for people under the age of 13, because people under the 13 were protected from that kind of data mining by law. So they had to change the content that they were producing and create a special category for like cartoons that might be aimed at 7-year-olds that were on YouTube. And so those kinds of regulations that come from the state due to those kinds of concerns, privacy concerns around the viewers might have, they probably should have, I'm sympathetic with, but overall, I think we should err on the side of free discussion rather than worried about regulating a media that and a medium that is unique in its ability to give people an opportunity to think together and organize together and express a variety and diversity of opinion that you wouldn't have found in the 50s. The other thing I want to say to Derek is that, there were sedition laws. There were many ways in which the United States.
There's the Comstock Act.
Right.
Like
the United States.
There's the fact that before the Civil War,
right,
the Bill of Rights didn't even apply to state governments.
Right. I mean, it's been a long struggle to try to achieve the freedoms that we think of as being enshrined in this document, the Constitution, but which really had to be developed. So I'm not claiming that, in the past, back in the 1950s, we were all free and we could express whatever we wanted, and now we're being suppressed. I'm saying we have been in the process of losing things that we may have won in the 60s and 70s over the last 20, 30 years. And it's happening in a way that's a little bit more dystopian than the way you might think of it in the past, because of the power and reach of these big tech companies and the way in which they can acquire data and use data at a rate and on a scale that hasn't been seen before. If you look into like the Snowden revelations, the way in which when Bush was in office, and right after 9/11, he created the Office of Information Awareness with their goal of TIA, total information awareness. And the idea was that they would just gather all the data that they could everywhere, phone calls, emails, and there were no tweets back then, but just any kind of electronic communication. They would gather it and record it and archive it. And they wanted to be able to also sort through it, and probably using machine learning to do it, or whatever that would have been then. And that was a PR disaster, so they changed the name of the institution. They changed it away from the Office of Information Awareness, and I don't remember what they called it, but the actual project didn't end. And we know it didn't end because by 2013, they were in the process of doing it. They had created, networks and programs to be able to capture data, and they had partnered with big tech to do that, including like Verizon and AT&T and so on.
I'm gonna help you out because you got to where I wanted you to go. Because my point is not that we should support what the Democrats are trying to do with this, or frankly, how the Republicans are trying to use this very one-sidedly, because we're also seeing an entirely different war on freedom of expression, not just in public institutions like primary schools, but in higher education, which I guess have some public funding, etc. And a lot of the people who are worried about the Democrats on this are turning the blind eye that the precedent is bipartisan. It's been bipartisan now for a long time. What I am saying actually is that this is a long durée process that really kind of kicks into gear, and like the development of state capitalism. And by this I don't mean like in the Soviet Union. I mean literally what Bukharin was writing about in 1910 about the bourgeois governments having to use the state to play a more active role in supporting capital. This is part of their whole argument about imperialism. But this also is part of why this has been a more contentious issue, because what the courts have always used as the reason why broadcast could be censored is that they're on a public airway. Now with the internet, you have kind of an interesting problem, all right? Because the internet is technically not public. We have the World Wide Web because the founder of the World Wide Web deliberately forgoed anyone claiming patent or copyright to it. So it was free to the world. And we have the issue of servers being located in different countries. Now, there are ways in which, for example, the EU or any government can put pressure on these corporations to create different internets. And when we talk about, say, for example, the European Union, there's not really even a pretense to free speech in the same way as there is here. Now, I think that's an interesting problem. I always like to remind Marxists that Marx's first political concern was actually free speech. That's what the earliest political writings we have by him are about, freedom of the press in Germany. So this is not a non-Marxist issue. The Marxist point about free speech is free speech could never be truly free and capable because you have to pay for the access to the means to use it. Ironically, it's anytime that those means are public in U.S. laws when they're actually more subject to government censorship. What I think is fascinating is, you're right, it's a 250-year struggle in the bourgeois world to attain something like free speech. It's always been kind of superficially true, but we can think back. One of the things why I mentioned the Hays Code and why I didn't get to it at the time is the Hays Code was also used to adjudicate how particular groups were portrayed during wartime. And there was backdoor and probably illegal coordination between the military and private corporations to make sure that, say, when we were not in league with the Russians, they were portrayed in a general way. And when we were in line with the Russians, they were portrayed in a completely different way, in a way that, frankly, got a lot of people punished when we flipped back to not being aligned with the Russians in the 1950s, because it was the work that was allowed between 39 and 55 that was used against a lot of those artists when they were encouraged to by the code and the government to make relatively pro-Soviet Union
material. Propaganda, wartime
material.
propaganda.
Yes.
Yeah.
Real-time propaganda. And I mean, and the obvious thing about this is the first thing that the Federalists did, their first big legal push after they convinced everyone that the Bill of Rights would be enough to protect speech is prove the Anti-Federalists right by passing the Alien and Sedition Act. And we still do have sedition laws. It's just sedition has been redefined in a way that is more complicated than it was in the original Alien and Sedition Acts. To get into what I think we should be really worried about with this right now, and with treating this as a culture war issue. And I am going to read a Taibbi headline, so people can't say that I hate him. Senator Mark Kelly calls for social media censorship to prevent the bank runs. So what we see is increasing calls for information management to prevent public hysteria, being used to shield information that protects capitalist interests.
Right. And I just want to point out how terribly awry this is going to go. I happen to talk to one, but I think fairly representative Trump supporter on a fairly regular basis. And when you get caught out lying like this and then trying to control the story, because the thing is, they're not effectively controlling what people know. So you get caught out lying about something like a bank bailout and bank failures, you're just going to exacerbate the kind of conspiracy theories and panic you're trying to forestall. It's like, oh, it's so bad they won't even let us know the truth. They're covering up malinformation. This is going to backfire in terms of like quelling a panic or hysteria, and also just people deserve to be able to know what's really going on. That's especially people who we want to see take responsibility for their lives and organize for a new kind of political order and be able to respond to these crises in ways that are going to be more creative and effective and far-reaching than anything that the people who are setting up these restrictions can imagine. So, anyway, I'll let you go on, Derek. But it's outrageous to me that when the war in Ukraine started, that we moved from having content moderation policies on YouTube that were about the vaccine hesitancy and COVID to having content moderation policies on YouTube that were about the war in Ukraine. When that happened, it was clear that our political rights had been infringed upon, and that the excuse of safety and health was only a pretext for an attempt to create control over the kinds of things that could be said in public or online.
Do you think this, though, is a kind of inevitability of the way social media has developed? In general, when we see these new social media, or rather internet tech companies, their success is usually built on disrupting existing patterns, whether it patterns of organization and economic activity, right? And when things like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube took off, it was kind of a wild west. There was all kinds of content on there, and over time, of course, there was, YouTube got into trouble because people were, rebroadcasting movies and television series, et cetera. But what we've seen is, as social media has become more embedded in society and more generally used, that there is this inevitable catch-up of the state trying to regulate it. Like when it first comes onto the scene, it's not regulated. That there's a kind of accidental free space, precisely because the state doesn't really have the tools or the mechanisms to interface with these companies. But really, once a new social media turns up, it's only a matter of time before pressures, either from private interests or from the state, come to bear on this new sort of mechanism. It's like an inevitability.
I think it's almost always from the state. I think that for it to be effective and in order for private interests, for instance, in the early days of the internet, in order to monetize the internet and be able to make good on investments, they had to get state support in setting up regulatory apparatus so that it could be monetized. And the thing about the early days of YouTube or something like LimeWire is what we saw there was that the technology was outpacing capitalism. It wasn't just outpacing the state. It was creating conditions where the justification for monetization or commodification of information had dropped away. And the only way that you could continue to monetize and commodify information and communication was to use state power to impose restrictions on distribution. And
I want to go into that. That's actually super important because that's also why I think the internet blows donkey nards now. But
it really does.
But in the real
Google is you can't even use Google to search for how to fix your toilet anymore. Google will give you 15 ads on the first page.
There's a bait and switch on ads and particularly as and I think it's directly tied to Fed rates.
And let's be honest, it's not just about it's not just the internet. Look at streaming. There was this golden age of streaming where everything or almost everything was on Netflix. Suddenly everybody gets their hands on it. Suddenly people actually we're not going to make money, and then suddenly they're bringing the ads back because you have this disruption. You have this kind of free-for-all period, and then you have this kind of consolidation where capital uses the state, as you say, to kind of ensure that they can still make money. And the state, especially with something like social media, is using it to enforce their particular pet peeves or to make sure that they're, to attack their political enemies as well. I mean, the fundamental problem is these social media companies are operating in a capitalist system, right? That's the fundamental problem with them. It's always going to end up like this precisely because of these incentives created by the capitalist system.
Yeah, but
can we talk about this?
Let me just raise this, and if you want to move away from it, Derek, you can. But I just want to raise this. You're right, Gene. But the other problem is that the force, the organizing force in a society that's meant to be trying to go beyond the capitalist system, that's meant to be organizing for a different kind of society, is caught up in these, I don't know, culture war games or I'm not sure what to call it, but it seems to be completely myopic about the events around them, so that when Matt Taibbi reveals that the state is intervening and canceling and suppressing all sorts of speech, including many people on the left around the world, their reaction is, well, Matt Taibbi is a shitlord. And,
well, that is a problem, is because left politics is a kind of echo of Republicans versus Democrats, right? The same fault lines that exist between Republicans and Democrats gets reproduced on the left, with those who align with progressive liberalism on one side and those who soft pedal the Republicans on the other side. But you really have that same kind of there are good guys and bad guys, right? That is a problem.
You think that the left, there's a part of the left that is soft pedaling Republicans? Is that what?
Yes.
Well, what is? You mean you're talking about MAGA communists or something like that, or then these new nationalists? I wouldn't count them on the left any more than I would count people
would you count? Yeah, exactly. Would you count?
I don't know. Maybe just
liberals on the left.
Just Chris Catrone, the last Marxist. That's it.
There you
That's
go.
all we got. No, I feel
do you want to say the magic words?
What remind me what they are, please and thank you.
No, the left is dead. Long live the left.
Is dead.
Do you want to say the magic words?
No, I don't want to say that right now. But okay, so Derek, when I kind of react to this idea that there are leftists who are soft pedaling, is Matt Taibbi? I think what I was reacting to is the implication that Taibbi or Greenwald, first of all, that they should be considered leftists, really, but also that they're soft pedaling with republicanism or the Republican Party.
Why would Greenwald and Taibbi do some bullshit about Alex Jones, where the free speech rights there aren't even about the kinds of free speech rights we're talking here? They're about like libel and defamation and malicious attacks and things that people should be civilly accounted
Well,
for.
but see, okay, so that's an interesting case. I don't know I didn't follow the defamation case against Alex Jones very far, but he did not get taken off of these websites, like social media sites, because of litigation against those social media sites, or because he was a financial risk. And it wasn't after the defamation case had been resolved. It was in response to, I'm not sure what, pressure to remove him.
I mean, I don't. I mean, that
when he
legal.
had not been in, as far as I know, in violation of the community guidelines. I think that
he was in violation of the community guidelines, actually, like pretty fucking clearly. He'd been violation of community guidelines many times before. The problem with the community guidelines, let's be honest, is that they're arbitrarily enforced at the best of times. Like one of the things that's made Facebook almost unfucking usable is they do now try to somewhat consistently apply the community guidelines, and they're so vague that almost anything will get you flagged.
And that's what makes the community guidelines so brilliant, really, because you could just kick off anybody for any reason because everybody violates the community guidelines, right? I mean, the community like Alex Jones, I mean, I suspect as well, it was partly because of these threats of legal action that were ramping up against him. Because you had the Chobani case with the yogurt company, you had the big legal.
You think they felt exposed? Like, you think Google and
yes, I think they certainly felt exposed by this because those were like pretty. Definitely you could make the case it was a violation of community guidelines, and there was all kinds of, implications for their brand and for what was going on with those companies in those cases. Now, whether you think defamation is a reasonable law or not, that's a different case. But certainly, I don't think Alex Jones was saying wild stuff on YouTube for years, but it did seem to like coincide with these long-term legal cases which were ramping up when he got banned. I mean, I don't know exactly.
It coincided also with the monopolization of the internet and the change in the kind of character of the internet, so that you would have, like in the old days, anything you could upload a whole movie onto YouTube and nobody would really notice. And then as real money started to get involved, I guess this sort of this regulatory, the need for regulation was there too. I don't know. I didn't really. I don't want to have to defend like even my own position on Alex Jones in the past right now, because I think there's sort of a knee-jerk free speech absolutism that people like Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi cling to, and which I tend to be very sympathetic to. But like, what actually caused, once you have this case of direct state interference and a clear violation of the First Amendment, anything below that starts to look maybe more acceptable. I don't know, but what my stance at the time was, it wasn't necessarily a violation of the First Amendment. Certainly shouldn't be considered a victory for the left that he was not on YouTube anymore. It wasn't like we had won some great battle. He had self-destructed, I guess, is the best way to look at it. And I thought there was a kind of a mentality of being pro censorship, and there was this idea that if we could just control the bad voices and get rid of the bad actors, we would then be able to, I don't know, get Bernie Sanders elected or somehow create a socialist project out of that.
It's your reformism showing, Doug. But
well, how's that?
get.
I'm characterizing the attitude at the time around people who were for censoring Alex Jones.
Okay.
I mean, I think there is a kind of impasse, right? There is a kind of impasse with this, because there certainly are things that I think are very hard to defend, and you would want to be censored. I mean, perhaps this doesn't apply in the United States, but if you go to a place like Sri Lanka or Myanmar, where like Facebook groups are being used to organize a pogrom against like ethnic minorities? Is that, would we want those kind of things taken down? And what's the response to it? Now, of course, there'll be people who say, well, no, the state shouldn't be the one doing it. But do you want child pornography? Do you want
Well, no, I mean,
child
pornography is not protected speech.
Yeah, I'm not saying
anywhere.
it's not protected speech. I'm not saying it's protected speech, but I'm saying that there's going to be some kind of censorship. There's going to be some kind of censorship.
Organizing for actual violence. That's not protected speech either.
That's not
Even
protected.
in the United States, it's not really what we're talking about in the Taibbi case or in the
Twitter I'm not saying that's what we're talking about. But inevitably, there is going to be some kind of censorship regulation. And there's going to be a spectrum of speech where there are clear cases like child pornography and, literally organizing a pogrom where it's like that should probably be censored like very severely because it's criminal, right? And then there's going to be gray areas where it's like, is this hate speech that's going to organize a pogrom, or does it free speech and things like that? Inevitably, the state is going to start pushing the boundaries of where that censorship mechanism, which is inevitable, is going to go, and there's going to be a question of where the line is drawn, right? And obviously, what we're seeing now is the line is not just being drawn on like things that are very obvious that should be censored, which I have no, I'm not going to sit here and say there should be like an absolute free reign. I don't think people should be able to organize an ethnic pogrom on Twitter, right? But now what's scary is the way that the state and interests in capital are taking an increasingly invasive line of the flow of information. And you've seen this story before. This is not like only happening in the United States, right? Social media has been, if you go back to the Arab Spring, people were talking about social media as being this like liberatory force that's going to allow people to overthrow these despotic governments. But very quickly, these despotic governments were able to find mechanisms through which they could manipulate and control the flow of information in their countries through a mix of, clandestine organization through Twitter bots and all those kind of things. And on the flip side, government pressure on saying, hey, you don't get access to our market unless you abide by our rules, right? And this has just been like a general tendency with these social media companies where they don't have they don't have the power that they were once ascribed like a decade ago. The kind of social media optimism that existed around the time of the Arab Spring was totally dissipated. I remember writing about this maybe 6 years ago about Turkey and how social media in Turkey was basically just becoming like a vehicle for the government to promote its favored narratives, right? And what we're seeing now is the American government is catching up with the curve, right? And Republicans and Democrats are trying to use use social media or narratives to promote their kind of party political interests, right?
Well, it sounds to me like one of the things that's in the background of what you're saying is that it's difficult for the left or for people who want to protect free speech and the freedom of the public to organize politically at all to determine where limits should be placed, and that because there will need to be limits, we will have to anticipate these kinds of excesses occurring. And in a sense, it's hard to argue with that. But what I think that we should admit that the concern about free speech, I mean, again, there's a difference between organizing for direct violent activity and discussing the concept of violence, say.
Right.
So I think that the limits can be discerned, but also what we need to risk is the freedom that we need in order to organize politically and have our own collective, independent set of priorities that would develop that would help guide us about not where the state should come in and impose limits, but what would generally be normative in a political movement. And anyway, so I feel like I'm probably being a little idealistic there, but I just feel like there's that just because it's difficult to determine where limits should be, and even though we have to accept certain limits, like we accept the limit of you know, you can't harass someone or you can't threaten someone's life, it doesn't mean that when we see such a gross violation like this, that the left's response shouldn't be to organize to oppose it, and which, you know, and as best we can. And I think it's actually an opportunity to break away from the Democrats, to show that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party do not have the public's interest in heart.
I mean, I think
who thinks the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have the fucking public interest?
I think everybody who thought that Debbie Wasserman Schultz owned Taibbi, or who people who
I think she had some good optics on him. I think she had some good optics on him. That's
I think
a different.
Okay, what people would say is that, oh, the Democrats are bad, but they're the lesser evil, and you know, it's in my
let me
interest
put it this way: even if somebody, look, even if somebody is total asshole, is acting in bad faith, if the information that they are producing is legitimate, it shouldn't be dismissed because the person who is putting it forward has bad interests or is a hypocrite about it, right? I think that's a very, like, I think it's entirely possible, and I'm not, to say, like, Glenn Greenwald, for example, I think a reasonable line would be, I think he's kind of asshole. He's definitely, has allows himself to be used by political interest, but that doesn't mean you should dismiss everything he says as being entirely illegitimate. And I've said this before, like Vaughn knows this. I'm a big critic of the Gray Zone and some of the stuff that the Gray Zone put out. But I think you would be a fool to dismiss every single thing that the Gray Zone puts out. Absolutely. Just as you would be a fool to dismiss everything that the New York Times put out. You can ask the question, why are they telling you this? What is in their interest for telling you the truth on a particular issue? But that's different from whether something is true or not, right? Yeah. So, like, we have to, I think what happens is, particularly because online media spaces encourage a kind of personalization of politics, where politics become associated with particular individuals who become representatives. People form parasocial relations with particular hosts so that they feel like they can't criticize this host and they can't agree with that particular host. Otherwise, they're portraying a political line. I think that's very dangerous. We can believe certain people are bad faith actors and assholes without dismissing every single thing that they say, because every group, I've said it before, don't trust the imperialists, but also be aware the imperialists will tell you the truth sometimes. And the question isn't what are they lying about? The question is, why are they telling you the truth? But the truth of a particular accusation should be looked at on its own merit. So,
which is why we should not align ourselves with people who advocate for the cancellation of media personalities, journalists, authors, etc., for having said things that are demonstrably wrong, like spreading misinformation or offensive, because even though they said something that was demonstrably wrong and offensive, that doesn't mean that next time they come out to bat, they aren't going to say something that's true, that's worth considering. And shutting down people from having a platform to speak is ultimately for the worst.
I'm more concerned about us owning the platform, frankly. I mean, this is where I was going to get to, because I think there's a fundamental contradiction between bourgeois rights here. And I mean different bourgeois rights here. One, there is the contradiction between freedom of speech and freedom of association in something like Twitter. And this contradiction between those two rights is taken advantage of.
A little bit. Like, where I mean, you're about to, but how does freedom of association come up on Twitter? particularly because
it's owned by a particular group, and they can decide who they're responsible to and who they want on and who they don't.
Rights. Yeah,
it's a property right, right? But it's also like even beyond the property right of it, unless it is a quote public space, and by this we mean a government approved public space, which is part of the problem. That contradiction is not just about property rights, it's also about association. Those things in that instance, now there's places where they contradict, but those things in that instance work in tandem against freedom of speech. And the government has figured out how to, through proxy agents, utilize that tension in a way that is legally unassailable and rooted in the commodification of rents, and rents in specific here. I should actually call it commodification, because what's actually driving this is the decommodification through the removal of socially necessary labor time. The reason why Napster is such a big fucking threat to the Capitol is it makes the socially necessary labor time to produce something like music at the standpoint of reproduction, not an experience. We're talking about something
not the
there,
musicians, but the distribution.
Physical object, and the distribution of the physical object was brought down to zero because you didn't need the physical object anymore, and it could reproduce instantly. That to control that, and this was what Baccarin was on in his imperialism book way back 110 years ago. What to control that tendency in capital, there was an increased interface between capital and the state to re-allow rents. All right. The big movement of earlier bourgeois civilization was against most, although not all, Marx makes that clear in Capital Volume 2, forms of rents. That is no longer true. Now, I'm not a believer in the neo-feudal thesis, because it doesn't really actually explain how things are going on right now. It looks at epiphenomena things and not the base of the actual economy. But when you look at where the valorization of superficial profits are, it's in these media companies. Now, I want to show you the dirty secret about how bullshit that is, because it is related to something else you care about, which is the banks. What happens when you can't leverage the cheapness of debt against constantly pumping what is probably unwise investments into these rent-seeking apparatuses?
You get backstopped by the federal government.
Yes, because you fail. Right. And so the only way to handle that is for the government to backstop you in a way that shocks both leftists and actually a lot of rightists, because it completely makes all the claims of market hazard and moral hazard claims go to the wind. But it's already in. These things are only profitable because of coalitions with the governments of the world.
But so
to maintain property rights. And of course the governments are going to ask for shit back. Particularly because they're not like, so like,
but we shouldn't allow the state. I mean, it's inevitable that the state is going to set up these sorts of agreements that support monopolies, and we should fight against it. But it's to fight against it, we'd have to fight against it as the working class, I think, and you know exactly how I can't spell out in a heartbeat here. But the thing is, while I understand that the same mechanism that's at work when you get rid of LimeWire, in order to protect corporate interests, is at work when the Department of Homeland Security cuts a deal with Twitter in order to control the narrative around Ukraine. Like, I understand it's the same kind of logic that's going on, and that really the state and the corporations are being pushed to integrate in a million different directions. But nonetheless, in this instance, given that it's not only intervening in what we can read, but what we can say, and the difference between Facebook and the telephone is maybe a little bit blurry, that the infringement on our everyday rights is vast here, and it's when you throw in the fact that they're collecting all of this data, so we're under surveillance and we're being told what we can say. and who can hear us. So that's all.
Yeah, there's a good question on this because I can actually answer it. Did the podcast in Saxony in the 17th century have the same debates about printing press and all the damn pamphlets floating around? And the answer is absolutely they did.
Yep.
So quit it. So the my point to you, Doug, is not that I disagree with you, except in that we should not be picking up the exact talking points of Taibbi and Co. that this is new.
Oh,
all right. This is not new.
Right. I agree with you. And I don't think I've done that really very much, in my tweeting.
I just want you to clarify. And that if we're going to push for this as socialist, we actually have to push at the root of the problem, which is the fact that the change in technologies and capital have endangered traditional modes of commodification. Even people like Robert Brenner see this. And that we actually have to take a far more aggressive and radical view of socialization and pivot it as a fight for free speech. Because what we know from the Republicans is that verbatim, the moment you give them state power, they do not give a shit about.
Oh yeah, I mean, obviously this is not. I mean, right? It's not like I have any confidence at all. I mean, even Greenwald would say he has no confidence in the Republicans not abusing state power.
I think
he remembers the Bush administration.
You have people, lauding the Twitter files. You have elements lauding the Twitter files, which I have no issue with Taibbi reporting on this. It's fine, whatever, it's reporting. And all reporting is compromised.
Yeah, I think that's so weak because if you had said after Assange revialed the execution of farmers in Afghanistan,
that's reporting.
Through a secret leak, that it's fine. Whatever, you would have been, you would have been part of the campaign against Assange to try to cover up the story by cynically reducing it into something that's non-remarkable. I mean, it's not new. It is remarkable. It is significant. It actually has an impact on people's everyday lives. Go ahead.
What I was going to say is the issue is the issue with the is that we have some people who will laud the Twitter files reporting, and I'm saying it's fine. I don't have an issue with the reporting of the Twitter files. I think it's entirely legitimate journalism, and people will say, well, it's slanted. Well, all journalism is slanted. Every journalist has an angle, and you can sift through the angle to find what is important. But a lot of those same people are celebrating Ron DeSantis and all the kinds of clampdowns on freedom of speech, making all kinds of excuses for that as well. I think the critical part for the left is to maintain that this is a bipartisan consensus on censorship, number one, and number two, not allow themselves to be dragged into a partisan political debate over which is worse or, this, that, and the other, to avoid being sucked into the Democrats and avoid, in response to not wanting to be sucked in by the Democrats, to not get sucked in by the Republicans. Because I think that's what happens so often, because left politics, you have a kind of majority that ends up rallying behind the Democrats. And then you have a contrarian minority that, in response and understandably, will end up kind of soft pedaling Republican assaults on freedom of speech.
Well, we are faced with this moment where we have a proxy war raging in Ukraine, revelations coming out about the fact that we were lied to in various ways during the COVID pandemic again and again. And so now we've got complete mistrust across both parties and the health sector and the state health sector. we also have these revelations that we're being censored, and our
Which
conversations are
lies are
being
we
controlled.
referring to
Huh?
on health stuff? Which lies are we referring to in health
Yeah,
stuff?
well,
I
like,
know there have
I mean,
been.
like, good, masking is bad, masking is good. Vaccines are gonna the vaccines have been tested and shown that they will stop infection. Well, maybe they weren't
Well,
really tested
that was
adequately.
extremely damaging when they knowingly lied about the masks in order to protect mask stock.
Right. I mean,
By the way,
yeah, that
one
was
second, guys.
extremely.
I have to address something
What?
in the chat. In the chat, Jean is making a guilt by association argument. What guilt by association? Vaughn,
Well,
have I made
let me get to the end of this point, and then I have to take off in just a minute. But the thing is, we are dealing with a lot of mistrust in the current administration that is expressed, amongst independents and Republicans the most, but also within the Democratic Party, like something like 35%, or I don't remember. I heard this on Breaking Points, and so I'm going to get this fact wrong, but some statistic like 20, 28, 23, 35, somewhere around there of Democrats think that the COVID was leaked from a lab in China on purpose as an attack on the United States. Okay. And so we have a real mess right now with a lot of mistrust. And we're all going to be on the left put in a position of deciding, are we going to allow ourselves to prioritize getting Democrats reelected? Or are we going to try to break off and develop an independent political project? And that will sometimes look like siding with Matt Taibbi over Matt Leck, which, by the way, I think is a no fucking brainer. Okay. So, and that's where I'll stop. I got to take off. I got a call from my ex about my kid who got his tonsils out. So,
Oh, okay. Well, Doug,
Okay.
thank you for joining us on this White Guy Wednesday. Would you like to come back on another White Guy Wednesday?
yes. And I'd like to end the next one by randomly attacking some other YouTuber. So that would be my goal for the next time I come on. Just
You can always randomly attack me.
yeah, it's no fun. Everyone expects it, but to bring up Matt
Yeah.
Leck out of nowhere for no reason. I mean, there is actually a reason, but anyhow,
His first name was Matt, and
that was also because the crap he did on the Majority Report. Anyway, guys, I'll let you guys continue on without me. You can run me down while I'm gone. Bye.
Well, Doug, goodbye.
It is ungentlemanly to stab a comrade in the back, so we will wait to stab him.
Yeah,
to
we'll
his
have
face.
to stab him to his face.
No, I think there's a lot there. I think the problem is we're still getting lost in the framework. And I can see that from a lot of the response here. For example, when we talk about the mask lies, we're not talking about the government's lying about mask working. We're talking about the government's explicitly lying about mask non-working and not owning that they did it, which they did.
Yeah,
CDC
at the beginning of the pandemic, they were concerned about mask stocks, so they told people not to use masks initially because they didn't want them running out in the hospital. I think that would,
and instead of just trusting people not to panic and buy them all, they and actually that's happened multiple times. That's why I was asking Doug, though, because what gets thrown around as lies in these things are, some of them aren't lies, some of them are misrepresentations, some of them where I literally think everybody's lying about what the research says. Another example is like people lied about vaccine efficacy. Journalists did. In some ways, the Democratic Party overrepresented it. But I will say that doctors, by and large, did not lie about it. So it's these things being thrown around blanketly is a lazy habit that we have. And I don't know that Doug means to do that. I'm not trying to like dog him here. I actually know that if you push Doug on this, he'll usually define it pretty clearly. Like he talks about what the science does show on the vaccines, and where you're confusing political actors saying ridiculous shit with official government policy, which was sometimes sketchy, with what the doctors were saying. Those are three different things that get conflated together. I think we have to be very careful about all that. I think where we win is to reframe this framework as independent. But I do want to get to, like, what is the counter policy or the counter project that people want here? Because the irony of a socialist party in the United States is that you're going to have to change 50 states' election laws to do it. Right? Like that there's a 60-year project to make sure that the current parties are locked in place because there were real threats in the early 60s, and that really showed up in the division specifically within the Democratic Party. It's always in the Democratic Party where this shows up, because the Democratic Party is a less coherent party than the Republicans, and has been for, although it's actually probably not true anymore. There is a way in which the marginal base of the Democrats and the marginal base of the Republicans, I don't mean like their mass base, but I mean like the key donor sub bases have kind of flipped. But and that happened in the 70s and 80s. This whole thing that we're dealing with here is the question of political independence. It's a question that, say, the DSA left has a hard time asking. Why? Because they've bet everything on an Ackerman plan that they immediately abandoned. Right? If we cannot make a narrative about how the collusion of capital rent-seeking tendencies with the government means that all this libertarian stuff about private speech being where free speech is a problem, and it's a huge problem. And we can see it by the fact that this current situation with government using backdoor collusion on pressuring and the thing is, it's multiple parties. It's not just Democrats. Like, one of the things about the Twitter files that does come out is Republicans did it too. They were just less effective and they didn't do it as much. And frankly, they don't have as sympathetic of an ear in the company. Right. But they did try it. That was outed by Taibbi himself. I mean, Taibbi pointed that out.
Everybody wants to work the refs. I mean, everybody wants to work the refs. That's very clear from what the Twitter files have demonstrated. But I think, the impasse, there's a couple of impasses. Number one is, how do we deal with social media, right? Which I just don't see a solution. I mean, yes, I think pushing back on government interference,
it's absolutely important, but it's also not going to work. And it's hard to sell that, right? To say, like, we're fighting a war for free speech, but because of the private nature of ownership, it's always going to be a losing war until we socialize. And I actually mean socialize, not nationalize. I mean specifically socialize this, and that's not even a problem you can do, right? So there is all these issues with all of these narratives, and I've read a whole lot of science papers right now on a COVID, and I'm actually, like, very frustrated with every single political narrative out there about it. All right. Stuff whether or not we should have kept schools open, how we did that. I mean, we ignored what even other countries did. Like, some countries closed the high schools, closed the secondary schools, and kept primary schools open because we know the infection rates, even transmission rates, are different between age groups. It's not that there's none, but there's none in almost any of disease vectors. I feel like there is large-scale social distrust, which is very easy for currently existing powers to use to their advantage. All right. And I do agree with Doug on that. And that social distrust is from the failure of these institutions themselves, but also because increasingly it seems to me that there's, at our particular phase in the way politics interfaces with capital development, there's no way to maintain any kind of base except based off negative partisanship. That base is never mass, it's marginal, which also means that you have a massive tendency of even depoliticized political action. So what do I mean by that? I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms, right? But I mean, like, I know so many Zoomers who don't believe a single thing the Democrats say, but are going to vote for them every time for the next elections. And this is true for a lot of millennials too, people my age, because they're afraid of Republicans. They're not going to risk trying to do anything else, which is what I said to Michael Brooks many, many years ago when he was talking about, like, well, we have to stand with the Democratic Party until we come to the moment where we can break off and make our own. And I said, when is your enemy in this current environment ever going to be weak enough where you're willing to actually do that? It's not going to happen under current conditions. And until you come up with a way to change those conditions, you're kind of stuck in a cul-de-sac. And so the promise of the Ackerman program or whatever is a false promise. But the idea that we can just like will off of one issue, being free speech, to create a counter movement to the powers that be, we don't have any historical evidence that happens. Like that's not what happened with the Bolsheviks. If you want to look at that, that's not going to be enough to build a counter movement off of. And the idea that one event or one corrupt element of capital is going to wake everybody up to that, to me, is fundamentally naive. And if it makes me a shill for the powers that be to say that, then you're saying that saying the truth of our historical evidence makes you a shill. And I don't think that's true. I think we have to look at what it would take to create an independent political force, because what most people do is go, oh, you're strategically doing something, well, you must be a Democrat, or oh, you're strategically doing something where you must be Republican. In reality, when most people are strategically trying to align and realign within the parties, they are doing that, but so are the people criticizing them, and they don't want to own it, right? Because they don't have a means, they're not even bothering to create a means to build up that political center, and I don't, outside of the current existence. They're not building
that
dual power or anything like that.
And that's what I mean by left-wing politics ends up just being an echo of the Republican-Democrat conflict, because when people want to really turn against the Democrats, they end up aligning with the Republicans. And it's a kind of impasse. It's very difficult because, as you say, Vaughn, like, it's not simply an issue of will, but there's an entire legal superstructure out there that makes it very difficult for third parties to emerge. It's hard to get representation, even on the local level, let alone the national level. The left is deeply unpopular, and what little left
and it's
there
wedded
is
to the national level. This is the other thing. I'm seeing every comment here is wedded to doing things at the national level, like voting at the national level. We got to vote for change at the national level because that's how national politics works. Unfortunately, you live in a federated country.
And here's a comment. What's the alternative? Let the Republicans usher in fascism and get murked. It's one of the issues is you can't predict the future, right? You could miscalculate and let a very far-right regime that's going to crush you in. But the alternative...
Or you could also empower a weak-ass liberal regime that actually builds a legitimacy for a far-right regime.
Yeah, so...
Like either way, you're kind of fucked.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
you're kind of in a... It's unfortunately, no one can predict the future. No one can know when the threat of fascism is a real concrete threat, or when it's just being used to, kind of get people to align with the liberal flank of capital, right? Okay, so we got a super chat along the lines of what Vine is saying. We literally just need to start convo about building political power outside the Democrats on a scale of generations. Maybe it is a scale of generations. I think we're in such a bad position. We may have to just consign ourselves to trying to lay the intellectual foundations for some kind of independent political power, because we're like really at a kind of political impasse. And it's very frustrating because people want to find an answer, right? I think one of the reasons people rallied behind Bernie Sanders is or Jeremy Corbyn in the UK was because it felt like that there was a route to some kind of meaningful change, right? That there was actually a path that was being outlined. Because the alternative is sectarian irrelevance. And then you can do sectarian irrelevance inside the Democratic Party or Republican Party, or you could do sectarian irrelevance outside the Democratic and Republican Party. But either way, you're going to be irrelevant. And it's frustrating.
It's more about collateral damage. It's easy to say this when you're safe from whatever consequences when the chips fall. Who's fucking safe from when the chips fall? You're talking about right now about powers that might lead to a nuclear war. Who's safe where the chips fall? Like, a lot of people have been convinced of like narratives of harm and harm reduction that are analogous to things in medicine that are not actually that strongly analogous to things in medicine. Like, with these policies, almost everybody's going to be touched by it. There is no one untouched by it. Like, you are talking about all kinds of things that are downstream. Yes, different pee them, feel them more. The people who are largely removed for it are the people dominating the debate about it, including the people telling you that you should always care about where the chips fall. And yes, I'm not saying you shouldn't, right? That's what dual power institutions, as conceived of and the Second and then in the Third International, were about, was to have your own power to protect people from what happens when you try to do these things. If you don't, you get into the same cul-de-sac that the SPD did in Germany, and we all know how that turned out, don't we? Did they stop the fascists? Come on, children. Do you remember your history? And I know I sound condescending, but that is the level of some of these comments. We have to think through this more rigorously than that. And I think when it comes to like the Twitter files, I am not one of the people who ever said it was a nothing burger. I have not said that. I have been very frustrated by the way we have framed this, even when we're trying to defend people like Taibbi. I think Taibbi's journalism in this is fine. There's other times where his journalism is shit. We have to call it on what it is, and we shouldn't expect, we shouldn't even expect people who nominally declare themselves socialists and Marxists to be particularly good on these issues, much less people who don't. But it's not their job. It's ours, right? But I also think if we give in to the framing that a lot of these people are giving it, we are losing a lot of our ability to drive this for deeper analysis of what is going on. That's why, like, when we got stuck in that, we're like, it's not about the culture war, but then we talked about it in terms of political power, but still kind of the culture war, but not, but yes, but no. And I'm like, let's just talk about how this happened. It's about public-private partnerships, coalitions to deal with decommodification, etc.
It's about the fact that social media disrupted a whole way that information was shared. You had a Wild West period, but inevitably the state and the existing interests in capital had to clamp down on it to maintain their profitability and for the state to maintain a control on the flow of information, which they had previously had. You know, a lot of Silicon Valley's business model is about doing illegal stuff and disrupting regulatory mechanisms. You know, that's how they make money. But inevitably, they end up getting regulated in the end. That's why it's kind of like a get-rich-quick scheme. You make your quick bucks, and then, you know, the regulators come in, the interests come in, and you get squished, right?
Rent seekers are always going to align themselves with elements of the government that are highly under-policed. But that should also not give us, like, this is another thing I want to push on. Pretending that the regulators, even though what they might do is good, are somehow not capitalist is a little bit ridiculous too. And there's so many ways in which we are stuck in these frameworks given to us. And on this, I kind of agree with Doug. We're stuck in these frameworks given to us by this partisan divide. My pushback is, when you talk about this in a new way, when you try to introduce it to something beyond just, because I'm not talking about this in terms of framing. All All right. I'm talking about this in terms of explanations of why it happened. That is not about a media frame. People can frame that however the fuck they want. Everyone seems to conflate those two things automatically in their head because they've been talking about the level of tactics for like 10 years. Like we were there, like we had the tactics to do this because somehow that all the proletariat, whoever the fuck we think they are, secretly agreed with us. And as soon as we got the right tactics, bam, and I mean, you even see this in people like Chomsky. It's like, well, public opinion polls show that people believe in progressive and socialist policies, blah, 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 blah. Right. And it's true, but it doesn't mean anything because people also don't believe that progressive politicians are ever going to deliver on those policies. So it's irrelevant.
And also, it comes down to how you frame the question. If you say, do you want to have free healthcare? They're like, sure. If they say, do you want to lose your existing quite okay healthcare plan and have a government healthcare plan, they'll be like, no, I don't want that, right? It all comes down to seeing what you want in the tea leaves, right? It comes down to seeing what you want in the opinion polls, because the opinion polls can tell you whatever you want them to tell you. In fact, there's a whole industry of opinion polls telling people what they want to hear.
Yeah, it's gotten it's easy to manipulate opinion polls, like and not even like in a really conspiracy way. It's
like ask the question as the way that you want it. So I mean, yeah.
And even when the opinion polls are good, sometimes the categories are bad. Like it's just the whole thing is kind of its own thing. Conversely, people who say don't trust the opinion polls, trust what I say reality is, are usually also playing an even less sophisticated show game. Like, and I know people often listen to me and go, Varn, you don't think that we can do anything. You think everything is doomed. I'm like, no, you can do stuff by starting to realize what it would take to build counter institutions. Do we know what that takes? I don't. It's not my job as an individual to have all those answers.
And
for
it's not
you.
a podcast.
It's
not really something you should be like hoping a podcast will give you.
Yeah, for real. I mean, also,
if a podcast is telling you what to do, right, take it with a grain of salt, right? I don't know I have zero idea what the political way forward is. My point is just to critique things, but I'm not pretending I have an answer to anything. With the whole social media thing, right, I just see it as a kind of impasse because there are certain things on social media that you do want to have regulated, and the only mechanisms under capitalism to have them regulated is state regulation. But the point is, state regulation can never be confined to what we want it to be confined to. It will always, by the nature of the way regulation functions and the incentives, there will always be creep into areas where we think are totally illegitimate for them to be regulated. So, I don't know what the solution is. Like Varn, says socialization, but of course, socialization isn't something that happens in isolation, does it?
No. When I say socialization, I'm actually implying that you have to build a long-term political project to seize power. And I'm not saying get a fucking elected. All right? I'm actually kind of implying that a whole lot of this debate is because a lot of you, maybe haven't killed the liberal or conservative in your head. And by conservative in your head, I mean liberal because they're both really liberals. And I know I'm going to hear all the people, well, Marxism is delivering on the promise of liberalism. I'm like, yeah, it's supposed to deliver on the promise of liberalism because liberalism is incoherent and can't. Like, it never has been coherent from moment one. So you have to deal with this. I'm not saying that in a socialist society that there would be no regulations. Regulations in a socialist society where this is socialized would be societed by everyone in society. Part of what it means, right? And that would be an internal debate of which free speech would be very useful. I highly doubt that if more people have equal power, that they're going to want to risk the curtailing of speech in a temporary sense for one power over another, although I could be wrong about that. Maybe I should be more cynical about people. I find this frustrating, though, and as I've said this, because I keep on talking about you got to go beyond like these comparisons. You got to go beyond your parasocial attachments. You got to be able. Well, somebody's done more good than the online left. What's your fucking bar? That's a low bar. That bar is effectively nothing. Like, did a journalist do his job that makes him some kind of hero? Like, come on. The fact that we are doing 2 quoques and bare minimums more often than not tells me that we are not ready, not because we don't have a plan. We do need principles, but we're not going to have a plan ahead of time. I'm not going to just point out that that's Marx's critique of utopianism, is that you overinvest in a plan before you know what the conditions are actually going to be. So you create, blueprints in the sky that have all kinds of failure conditions in them that you don't see because they're for a world that doesn't exist yet. All right. You have to actively participate in building that. And by building that, I don't just mean the discourse around it. And that also means that when we encounter things like this discourse around the Twitter files, it is our job to take them and move them somewhere beyond it.
Exactly.
It is, but I also think it's like that to treat it as a nothing burger is to give in to the current political framing too. We need to take this and look at it and analyze it beyond the framing, beyond even building our own framing, and then we can build our own framing around it. But just looking at it superficially, or in terms, that's why I keep on bringing up the history. That's why I keep on pushing about the longue durée of this. This is very important to understand. All right. And I'm going to quit ranting because it just gets me more and more angry.
Well, someone in the chat accused me of guilt by association, which was precisely not what I was saying.
You were actually saying the opposite.
Literally saying the opposite of guilt by association. Guilt by association leads to you ignoring something, a truth that is being given to you by an inconvenient messenger. And we should always be aware of that sometimes the crappy messenger is different from what's being told to you. And you have to be able to, and as Vaughn says, the point is not to accept the narrative that is being given to you along with the truth, but to try and understand what that specific information is telling you and how it fits into something more broadly. And not, yes, there'll be news sources you trust more than others to give you accurate news. But don't just immediately accept the framing that is being given to you, even if it's being given to you by a source that you trust or a source that you feel is acting in good faith. I think that's precisely the problem, that we end up being like totally locked into our media bubbles because we want to maintain coherence of our, want to be on our team, play by the team, right?
Yeah, I'm going to respond to one more thing that I think is both fair and insufficient. So fair means I think it is a true statement. One is about like how we got stuck in the culture wars because the left moved into academia and abandoned the unions. One thing that I pushed on even Pascal Robert about is like, but let's talk about what happened in the unions. All right. Because the unions started building bureaucracy that was less and less accountable to its base, even as early as the 60s. After the communist purges, you start seeing them investing. By the time you get to the 70s and 80s, you have union leadership being paid off of investment money, not dues, and then you have the establishment of a professional cadre within the unions that have more explicit ties to political actors than they do to anyone in the union itself. And then you have the paradox of closed shop, which is fair. It is a closed shop is fair, but it actually accelerates oligarchical tendencies within the unions, right? That's why that happened. Okay. Now the academy is worse. I don't know why everybody thought it was a good idea, but it is why that happened. We have to look at, again, we always tend to stop in our historical analysis at the most recent cause and at the most recent fight. And we have to look at this in a much longer term if we're going to build something that doesn't accidentally replicate elements of the same thing. Now, it's never going to replicate the exact same thing because material conditions, i.e., the world itself, is constantly changing. So in some ways, like I'm always like, oh, if we're fighting the battles of 1920, we really can't actually even deal with the fact that very few of those conditions apply right now, even if things are similar. And I know this gives a lot of people cold comfort because it is sort of like, okay, to build an actual alternative political project is to actually admit that you're going into something where you have principles, the implications of which you don't know. All right. And you have analysis, the manifestation of which you don't know. It was a lot easier when we all believed that socialism was inevitable, that there was no other way for history to go. But I don't know hardly any socialist who still actually believes that. So we're in a much bigger thing, and those principles are the important thing. Now, the principles need to be attached to a political subject, and the political subject is best when it's a class. That's how a class, in the Hegelian sense, moves from the class in itself, i.e. the sociological class, to for itself, i.e. a class that can act in a political way. But like, we don't know exactly what that looks like with the working class. We just, particularly right now, because our models from it are from periphery countries and very recently that have barely had gone through bourgeois revolutions and required massive integration of the peasantry to be successful. There aren't massive peasants in most of the world now, so that's just not.
There are no peasants, and there's no colonial empires, really.
Well, colonial. I guess if you're technically saying colonial empires,
I mean, yeah, I mean, like I'm saying, colonial empires, like Britain and France, don't literally govern large parts of the world. That's all subcontracted out to the nation state, right? Yeah, like lapping conditions as if this is conditions that existed in the early 20th century is to miss the point, right?
I will say that we do have one example, and it's almost purely negative. It is the pre-World War. It is the pre-World War I Espay Day between what happens in it between, like, say, 1910 and 1921. Like, so yeah. I could rant all night. Gene knows it. I don't want to, so I'm gonna end here. Gene, do you have anything you want to say? I'm gonna act like I'm the host and not you. I'm gonna be the true white guy.
Oh, you're gonna white explain? Well, let's
I'm gonna white explain to you
for this evening. But thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Hopefully, we will do some more of these down the road. Kuba was away this week doing things to Ewoks, so we had to give him his Ewok time. But we'll be back tomorrow night. I believe there's economics talk, and on Saturday Jason will be discussing his new exciting article coming out from Sublation Media. So keep everything on the reel. Have a wonderful day. Hit the like button. If you can, go to both TIR and Vlog and hit that like button. Get those numbers up. Help us get up on the algorithm so that we're not being suppressed by the evil social media companies. And with that, as we say here on TIR, we are out.